Hello, everyone. I'm using the nifty new record feature on PowerPoint. I was bringing you this up-to-dated lecture on the DIE method. This is our analysis method that we're going to be using sort of throughout the course, as short as it is in the summer. And I want you to think of DIE not as like wee, but as the thing that you roll. Any artifact that we look at, any philosophy or phenomenon that we engage as humanitarians is multi-sided, and those sides represent different aspects of what we are looking at, from the thing itself to our memory of similar things, right? So this is an analysis method. And really think of it as a die that you roll. Whether it comes up as a 1, a 2, a 3, a 6, you're still looking at the same thing, just a different side of it. And what this method wants you to do is investigate different sides or even levels of any particular phenomenon. So by the end of this, you should be able to clearly identify the elements of DIE, what each of these letters stands for, and really be able to not only use it, but to hopefully explain to somebody else how to use this tool, because believe you me, this can actually help you in interpersonal conversations as well. We're going to look at the difference between this method and something you might be familiar with, which is the rhetorical triangle. You may have come across that in a speech or a composition class, similar, right, but a little bit different. And then this is going to become very important. The levels of interpretation. We've identified or named 4 levels, and I will level with you that really we're just putting language in this course to things that we kind of do naturally. But the more that we are aware and conscious of these things that we do, the more we understand really ourselves and the world. So let's begin. You are probably familiar with this. If not, let's run it down really quick. This is used in making a persuasive speech, in writing your essays. Again, if you've had composition, you've probably run across this. The rhetorical triangle from Aristotle, looking at the different ways that we can present an argument, right? Not a fighting argument, but like stating a case. Ethos at the top there represents the speaker or the writer, and this is the authority, the credentials, and really the ethics that you bring to it. You know, are you using sources that are reliable? Do you yourself have some sort of authority to speak on something, right? I'm a humanitarian. If somebody came and said, hey, we need you to help us build a rocket, if I were to say, oh, sure, no problem, you just, slap this there, put an engine there, hey, why don't we put some lighter fluid in there and get right? I have no authority to speak to building a rocket, right? If you were to ask me to engage why we should build rockets, why maybe private space flight, commercial space flight might be a good thing. Why do we find the need as human beings to go off planet? Yes, I have some ethos there. I've studied the myth, the stories, the drive, knowledge of history and why we started aiming for the stars in the first place. That I have ethos for. Building the rocket now. So this would represent arguments based on authority, right? Authority can be borrowed, right? You don't have to know everything about quantum science to talk about quantum science. If you've done research, you can point back to sources, you can borrow that ethos, right? But here's your speaker, your authority. Then you have logos, right? Logos then is the actual logic. It represents the argument itself. It represents facts, figures, an appeal to, the mind, logic, factual information. And then counterbalancing that on the other side is the pathos, right? And pathos is an appeal to emotions. This is like what's going to win your heart, right? Logos tries to win your mind. Pathos tries to win your heart, right? And we hear very divisive arguments being made purely on the base of pathos. The idea of the rhetorical triangle, right, is that you want to lead with one of these elements, but ultimately bring them into balance, right? If the speaking situation really merits going all in on one of them, right? Like an example of a pathos, an argument that's pretty much purely pathos, right? Is they can take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom, right? Battlefield speeches, locker room speeches. But a good coach, again, locker room speech isn't even really that off balance, because you've got the ethos of being a good coach, of somebody that the players should trust. They know their stuff. The logos of, look, guys, we need to make these adjustments in our game, and they can point to something specific. And then the pathos of, let's go win one. The difference between the rhetorical triangle and the DIE method that we're going to use, we're going to see some correspondences between the two, is that this is meant, the rhetorical triangle is a tool that you use to build an argument that you already have in mind, right? You're leading people someplace. Whereas analysis really wants to create a space for exploration. Right, so Kim Jackson, I have no idea why she puts my name first, unless it's just alphabetical order. But Kim Jackson and I are the two full-time professors of humanities in Terry County College. And she brought this method to the table. And now for 10 years, we have been collaborating on it, making little adjustments, looking at all the ways that it moves. And really what it is it's a variation of the triangle, but on the other end, right? We want to explore, to see what we want to argue, okay? Then eventually you can use DIE as a place from which to present a case, to present an interpretation of work, which is what you're going to do, right? But ultimately what it wants to do is to create a space for you to be heard, right? And more importantly, for you to be heard from your point of view and as who you are, how you want to be heard, right? By the broadest audience possible. And, also, it's not a linear process, right? DIE, again, looks at even how you feel about something, what you think about something. That's all part of the same system. Again, it's all part of that same die that you would roll, right? And so rather than being laid out, okay, I'm going to do some logos, I'm going to back it up with some pathos, I'm going to assert my authority, you're doing D, I, and E all at once. Ultimately, they're stacked. Um, and it really helps to gather content. And what's more, I found that it helps me to get clear about why I have a particular thought, where my opinions form, um, and what it wants to do is to create a self-awareness, an awareness of our culture and our surroundings, um, and a deep awareness of our belief systems, right, which is central to the humanities. So D stands for describe, I for interpret, and E for evaluate. Let's break down what those mean. But first, let's look at the dynamics of them. Right, so we are meaning-making machines. Human beings, everything means something, right? We're not animals running just on instinct. We have the blessing and the curse of thinking about things, of overthinking things, of interpreting everything that we see that happens to us. Right? Just look at your newsfeed. It's happening all the time. Right? That you're making an interpretation of an event. Right? People posting the memes will make interpretations for you. Heck, the news will make an interpretation for you. But let's look at the system of meaning making. So something happens. The thing that happens, happens. That is description. All right. If we're equating it to the rhetorical triangle, that's going to be your logos. All right. This happens. The rocket escapes Earth's gravity. But we make it mean something. Right? Think about the space race and getting those rockets into space. Back when we were competing, the United States, that is. Got to be careful about saying we. Um, when the United States and the USSR were in the space race in the 50s, trying to get there, right? What we might make it mean is that American scientists rule, America rules. Right? We have great minds. Okay? That would be the interpretation. We make it mean something. But then what happens is we take that interpretation and we make it the truth. Right? So the story that we tell, the evaluation about what happened, becomes what happened. If it doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will soon. Okay, but something happens. I give this example often. Say you are somebody who is studious, because you all are, right? Everybody's a perfect student in here, even me, right? And you're very conscientious about getting your work in on time. And you know what? Like life happens, you don't. And you're sitting in a classroom. All right, let's say for the sake of argument, it's my classroom. And I come in one day and I kick open the door and I just happen to catch your eye, right? The day after you've missed a deadline. And I'm like, good morning. And I slam my books down. Now, all that happened is that I came in, right? I said good morning, slammed my books down, right? Kicked in the door, right? All of these things are descriptive. But what did you make it mean? Did you make it mean that, oh my gosh, he's already checked, he's mad at me, I'm a terrible student? Does that become the story that you tell? Right? So that then you're apologetic the rest of the time. You don't know what happened. What happened is, like, I might have spilled my coffee on myself getting out of the car. I might have, been in traffic for 2 hours. I might, who knows what happened. But when we make an interpretation, then we tell a story about it, and that becomes our truth. The analysis process, we kind of want to reverse it. We want to look at the story that we tell, okay? And divide that story up by looking at like what actually is happening. So we want to explore possibilities and move away from the fixed and static understanding of any work of art. Right, because there's something that happens here. If we're talking about an artifact, okay, we're going to look at the movie, The Matrix. All right, I'm giving you a short film to do before this. All right, if then we look at this and there's a standard interpretation, then that meaning is fixed. But we're all going to see different things in the film. All right, really, the story that we tell is going to affect how we view this thing that is objective, right? Everybody's going to watch the same movie. Same color palette, same characters, same everything, right? But not everybody's going to see the same thing. So the analysis process, we have to back up and in the very beginning go, okay, what story are we telling? Are we already telling before we ever watch the movie? Or whatever you want to put in there as something happens, before that trial ever happens, before that election ever happens, what story are we telling that affects how we make meaning out of it? And the analysis process wants to explore how we've made the meaning. And what's more, what possible meanings we can make, because you and I are not going to have the same interpretation of the Matrix. We're not going to have the same interpretation of the 2016 presidential election. We're not going to have the same interpretation of who wins the soccer match. We're not going to have the same interpretation. I mean, there's a winner, right? But why did this team win? That team lose? What might have changed the impact? What excuses do we make for our own team? That's all interpretive. All right, and it's all about the story that we're telling when we come into that event. So I think it's simpler than to sort of back up at first and just break down the elements here. All right, so describe. Description is just the facts. The facts and only the facts. All right, so now this is actually tricky. Because we're meaning making machines, we want to dive right into what it means, okay? But it's like very, very important when you're doing an analysis to actually look at what's there. And I would say to not skip the obvious also. So yeah, you comment on the appearance, the sound, the smell, anything that we can gather through the five senses. We're not focusing on the sixth, which is thought. That's actually later. All right, your basic sensory input. All right, descriptions focus on the form of the thing. Its form meaning, you know what, if we're talking about films, I'm giving you an animated film to try this out on, short film, to try this method out on, right? You would say the form would be, it's a film, but it's animated. It's short, right? What is actually presented in it? What are the colors? Who are the characters? What is the plot? Plot is something that happens, right? So everybody can see that. These are things that anyone looking at, listening to, experiencing the event can see. All right, just the facts. And like whatever you're looking at, sure, there are certain vocabularies, right? If you're talking about music, you might talk about the rhythm, the dynamics, all right, going from soft to loud. It's easier in music to talk about the dynamics, right? Pitch, tone. If you're looking at something visual, you know, again, colors. We might talk about the balance of composition, etc., etc., right? But describing is only factual. What happens when we get beyond that, then, is interpretation. Some of the questions we can ask when we're describing are, you know, your basic who, what, when, and where. We'll notice that there are academic disciplines, and when you think of a discipline, think of like a course you would take, or even a path of study. Right? A discipline is a particular way of investigating the world. So the hard and natural sciences, they're very descriptive. We want to know how that process happens, like what happens, you know, the life cycle of a frog from an egg to a tadpole. It sprouts legs, loses the tail, becomes a frog. Visual arts, all right? We want to compose. Use colors, represent things in the world that are tangible and knowable. Geography, where is it? Anthropology, what's the timeline of our progression as humanity from one state of civilization to another? Ask that when question, and what was happening during any particular period of time. All right, so again, describe is factual. And when we look at description, we're looking at just the things that are there. And there's some disciplines that are very driven by that. Okay. Interpretation, the I, right? This is where we say, what does something mean? How does it make you feel? Right? Because when we just describe, the thing is not dynamic, meaning we're not really interacting with it, we're commenting on it, right? What is there? But as we know, human beings make meaning. This is where we say, what does it mean to me, right? Interpretations are individualized. This is why I will not hold you to a singular interpretation of anything, right? The E, the evaluation, will sort of tell me how you got there. Interpretation doesn't align neatly with any of the points on the rhetorical triangle. If I were to pick one, you have to align it with pathos, right? Because it does make you feel a certain way, but it also makes you think about something, right? Thinking is the thing that gets you into an interpretation of something. And they're dependent on our social and cultural values, right? You can also interpret something that already exists. When a band covers a song or performs a song by someone else, right? You're not just replaying it note for note, sound for sound. You're bringing your own feelings, understanding, skill, and interpreting that material. All right, so the interpretation, we're going to ask the question, right? What does it mean? There are 4 levels of interpretation, and we're going to use just a few very simple artifacts to go through this. And our goal is to get to that bottom level, right? Or the top level. You could reverse this, okay? If you say, are you going from a lesser interpretation to a greater? There's literal, the surface level interpretation, right? This is almost a pure description, okay? But it's putting together the elements of what is there to look at the whole. There's the symbolic. What does it represent? Right now, we're already bringing our values, our experiences, which are evaluative, right, to the thing that is there, the description, to create an interpretation. The allegorical level is where we're going to get into moral or ethical interpretations. And allegorical is like symbolic, but it takes the whole story, right, and or the whole composition, the whole thing that you're looking at, and likens it to something else. All right, and then the analogical or analytical then is considering everything that's there, why we are making the interpretations that we're making, to come to a deep understanding of what is being communicated on a very human level with this. I often use the example of like the Lord of the Rings. If you're not familiar with this story, it is a fantasy story set in a medieval-like Earth, but there's like, you know, elves and orcs and dwarves and everything. But there's a ring, all right? This is a ring. I have this ring right here. Literally, this is a ring. Okay, now descriptively, you say, it is a circular band. It is made out of a particular metal. This one's titanium. But it's a ring. Like on the literal, it's a ring. So in the Lord of the Rings, there's a ring, and there's an inscription on it that says, you know, one ring to rule them all. All right. Same thing in life, though. I put this ring on. I put it on this finger. Now it is symbolic of something. It is symbolic of my marriage, the unbreakable circle, that bond, right? In the Lord of the Rings, you put the ring on. It's symbolic of power. It gives whoever wears it power to stay young, to disappear, right, and become invisible. So it is symbolic of a power. Now, allegorically, we're working to sort of destroy this ring, which doesn't just give you power, but eventually corrupts you. Okay, so really there is Christian allegory in the Lord of the Rings, where the ring is a power, but it's a power for yourself. It is satanic. And then if you look at the analogical or analytical, you take into account that the author, J.R.R. Tolkien, was a World War I veteran. And he wrote The Lord of the Rings right after World War II, where he witnesses these back-to-back world wars, and he's English, so it's in his backyard in Europe. And how can human beings, right, as a devout Catholic, he is wondering how, if we are created in God's image, you know, according to his belief system, and, you know, are supposed to be inherently good, then how can people keep perpetrating the kinds of evil that he sees? And so analytical, you can say that this ring, right, which gives power, and people keep it even as it corrupts them and makes them feel heavy and selfish. It's addictive, right? So analytical, you can say that the communication is that power is addictive, corruptive, and it's the thing that gets in the way of our being our best selves. Right, so we go from the literal all the way to putting this whole thing together and looking at the context and trying to decide what the universal human communication is. Let's look at this as a symbol. All right, so descriptively, we have to stop at, there are three colors, right? There's an arrangement of stripes and stars. and it is rectangular. All right, so to see how close literal interpretation is to description, right? The first level literal is it's a flag. Now, what does this flag mean to you? If it means freedom, you're coming from a particular cultural belief system. All right? Maybe you grew up, I guess I did, say the Pledge of Allegiance. All right? I was a scout. I was an Eagle Scout. Right? So you look at this and you say, okay, symbolically, it's freedom, or it represents red, the blood that is shed for our freedom, white, the purity. The stars represent the 50 states of the Union. These are all symbolic interpretations. Okay, so allegorical. What story do you tell about this? What do you equate it to? Right, and each of these levels builds on the one before it. So literally, it's the flag of the United States of America. What does it make you feel? Right? Maybe if you're a historically marginalized individual, particularly in the United States, right? If you are, I would refer to my American Indian background as a member of Cherokee Nation. Maybe I have a little more contentious relationship with this, right? So the story that I'm telling is one of an empire being built, right? If you've undergone military service and you protect this symbol, maybe the story that you're telling is that sort of above all, why we respect this, and by so doing respect the very foundations of the ideas, right? So it could represent like the virtuous ideas. An analytical understanding means that we're looking at the various interpretations of this and how the flag becomes this encapsulation, not just of one experience or another, but of all the experiences collectively that we have as a nation, right? The promise, how we want to live up to that promise, where we're not doing a good job living up to that promise, right? And taking all of that into account, now you're on an analytical level. Okay, now let's go to a second. All right, so interestingly, we have roughly the same elements at play here. 3 colors, rectangle, stars on a blue field. However, right, so literally Confederate flag. When we get into symbolic interpretation, right, what's interesting is that, you know, this might be a trigger, and I really apologize. This may be a trigger for some people. But the interpretation can vary from, right, if you're saying, oh, well, this is a symbol of the South, right, and looking at it as symbolic of something that is regional or geographic. It's a much different conversation, right, than if you're coming at this as a person of color, as a person who would look at this historically and say, you know, a third interpretation is that, well, this is treasonous, right? Because it represents a breaking off or out of the Union of the United States, right? So already, just at that symbolic level, what it symbolizes for people is going to be completely varied. And then when you get to the allegorical, right, what holistic story are you telling? Right? That this is then used as a symbol of Southern pride. Is it, does this tell the story of people who want to own other people, of oppression? Um, is this about allegorically how fragile, right, something like a union of states is? And then if you get down to the analytical, you're looking at how those different stories then interact. And you're now looking at this on the level of, again, like, should we eliminate it? And we've decided for the most part that we should, right? Get rid of this symbol. So much so that it's like the Dukes of Hazzard, the TV show from the 70s and 80s, where they had the car that had this on top. It just becomes problematic, right? Because of what this flag symbolically means to so many people and how it can be hurtful, right? So for human beings, a flag is never just a flag. It is, but it's more than that, right? And the way that we get to talking about interpretations is by looking at the context, by asking questions and getting into the evaluative, right? Here's another image. Literally, people standing in front of a billboard. On the billboard, we see, people in the car, nuclear family, one of each kind of child, but then when you get into, again, even the description not skipping the obvious, when you look at the Caucasian family and the line full of people of color, the billboard looms over them, the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way, right? What does the American way mean? Depends on who you are, depends on when you are, depends on where you are, right? What does this image evoke for you? Can you go through the levels? And you have to get to the analogical level, the analytical level, to take all of that into account. What is literally there, what it symbolizes, and is this an allegory then for this sort of double standard, or even the lie or the myth of post-World War II United States, where to be American means smiling, happy nuclear family living in the suburbs with your white picket fence, with your little dog there, car in every driveway, turkey in every oven, when there is this reality that does not acknowledge, it looms over. And that these iniquities then continue and are driven by this kind of double standard that exists, right? So we're asking, what does it mean? What is the artist trying to communicate? Like, look at that last image, right? There was the billboard that was done by an artist. Then there was the picture, the photograph that was taken of the juxtaposition of, you know, people at a food line versus this looming the mythology of the American dream. What are they trying to communicate, right? What signs or symbols are at play, right? From stars to colors to size. The ring is a symbol, right? What messages are being conveyed? And so here, psychology and sociology, these are interpretive because they're not as cut and dried as science. We are recognizing patterns. So interpretation means that we're recognizing different patterns of behaviors, of symbology, of meaning, right, that continue to repeat themselves, right? So psychology, modern psychology, is driven by what are the repeated patterns of behaviors, symbols and dreams that people have, stories that people relate to. When we talk about the visual and performing arts, again, music is math. It's descriptive. Like sheet music, it's written out, you play this note for this long, and look, you crescendo or you get louder here, but the person who is bringing their own experience, skill, background, art to something is going to interpret that music. People performing a play or even filming a movie, yes, there are the lines on the page that I could read, but how do you act those lines? What motivation do you bring to it? That's all interpretive. Or we can look back at either of those symbols and look at the patterns that they represent. And we do this to understand, right, why something means what it means to me, to my group or community, or more globally. That's the evaluative part. So when we're looking at, so when we say, okay, what's the E, right? Evaluate this artifact, this event. We're looking at the context of it. We're going to see this with the Matrix, right? The Matrix is in 1999. There are at least 2 films before it that will create visual meaning for us in the Matrix. All right. But evaluation asks, and I don't believe that we have this question written here, what does it imply? Why does that flag make us feel what we feel? And right, there's the personal or individual. This is my experience. Okay, so as we use E as evaluate, you may also think of it as experience. Okay, E equals experience. There's my individual experience. There's the experience, the long-term experience of a group or community, right? If this is a faith-based group, right? What is the Christian interpretation? What is the Jewish interpretation? What is the Muslim interpretation, right? What is the pagan interpretation? What is the interpretation for women of a certain demographic, man of a certain demographic, right? Ethnic identities, regional identities, right? Anything can be, group or community can be relatively small, can be large, and we work all the way out to globally, universally, what does this mean? And we try to get to that level to get ourselves in the same conversation, right? Go back to the Confederate flag. You can say, well, this is oppression and it's about slavery. No, it's about regional pride, all right? But unless you understand the history behind it, those two people are never going to be in the same conversation. What we want to do is say, but look, here's where I'm coming from. My experience is this, okay? How does that interact with a group or community? And then universally, particularly historically, right? What's the context of this thing? And we see the Confederate flag's not so pretty, right? That maybe that Southern pride is built on something other than geography, right? And we can maybe open up or flip that conversation. We use the evaluative or the experiential to humanize the information. So listen, any interpretation that you come to, I said earlier, is okay. It's right. As long as you can pair it with this E and tell me where that interpretation is coming from. When we get clear about where our interpretations are coming from, one, we humanize ourselves. Two, we humanize the other person because we acknowledge whoever we're conversing with, because we acknowledge that maybe we're both coming from different experiences, right? And we want to share what those experiences are so that we can see the other's interpretation, and most importantly, so that you have a voice, so that you can be heard from your own position. This absolutely corresponds to ethos in the rhetorical triangle, meaning my experience. Okay, and remember that in this class, experience is evidence, but you have to state it, you have to lay it on the table. Okay, there's no interpretation without going back to a D. Like, what are you looking at that you're interpreting? Okay, you have to be able to clearly connect that. Then you have to also connect, right, the reason, the E, my experience is what makes me interpret this thing that everybody can see in an individualized way. But if we can work to a global understanding, now we're coming together in the same conversation. That's the goal of scholarship. So, here are some questions that we can ask. Look at how deep these questions run, right? When we're evaluating, we're asking why. How does it come to mean what it means, right? Also, like, what does this picture, this film, this event remind you of? Remember that evaluation is the story that we tell. It has a lot to do with memory, and we're going to look in several of our course films, the cyberpunk films, about memory. This genre has a lot to say about memory. What previous knowledges and experiences, right, or interactions influence these descriptions or interpretation. You know, a funny story is I was having sort of a back and forth text conversation. And it was a contentious one, a little bit of a text tussle there, and it ended with me receiving the thumbs up, right? And I knew sort of in that context, that it was kind of like a sarcastic thumbs up. And to this day, the thumbs up triggers that sort of feeling. Somebody can send me a thumbs up thinking they're going, yeah, great idea. And I go, what? What'd I do? What's wrong? What'd I say? They're like, what do you mean? I give you the thumbs up, man. I'm like, yeah, exactly. It's like that triggers this previous knowledge or experience that was given to me sarcastically as a way to kind of say, yeah, I'm done with this talk. Right? So what things do we carry around? That's a minor thing. That's a little thing. It's kind of funny, right? What big things, what big stories do we tell ourselves, especially about who we are, what we can and can't do, that may be affecting how we interpret everything that we see. That's why the academic disciplines that involve evaluation are history, right? To understand the history of that flag, of that image, of the myth of America, of the promise of it, of whatever you're looking at. Philosophy, how do things actually work? Why? Why is there suffering? Why is there joy? Why are we here? How does it work? And again, anthropology. So like a different angle is, why do humans do what we do? Why has culture progressed in the way that it has? Right? Okay. So, this is DIN. So this is not a formal assignment. We're not in the live class where I'm going to give you like 5 minutes to do this and then report out. But go back to those interpretations of the flags. And think about, write down if you want to practice, what is your interpretation? What is your initial reaction to each flag? And then how does your identity and your experience create that particular interpretation? Because we're all looking at the same thing, but what we see is going to be entirely different. Well, maybe not entirely. Right? Once you get back to the historical context, you're understanding how things came to mean that, we can get in the same conversation. But it is okay. It is expected. It is encouraged that you have your own individualized interpretation. The goal of DINE is to be able to stand and explain why you create that particular interpretation. I hope this is making sense. So try this exercise. What previous knowledges, experience, perspectives, and interactions influence your descriptions and interpretations of the flags? Right? And consider any identifier that comes with that. Right? That might be interacting. If you can identify those, then you know where you're speaking from. Now, if I were to give an exam in this class that was like one question, pass or fail, it would be, look up, it says activity, the context is decisive. It would be that statement. It would be, the blank is decisive. Fill it in with context, right? And context means like, what is all the chow around the event, the artwork, the flag, that you're looking at that creates a particular meaning? What is the context? The context is decisive. When we look from different places and different experiences, we see different things. And I think that is a theme that really comes through in some of the films that we're going to watch. So here's what you want to do, right? When I ask you to use DIE, remember that D is simply facts and sensory information. All right, never overlook the obvious. If that's an old white guy in the picture, it's an old white guy, right? If there are a lot of women in this space, maybe it's a feminine space. If the painting you're looking at is a mural, it's like 30 feet by 20 feet, it's huge. Don't overlook that. I is codependent on D. They can't say, oh my gosh, this is so wrong. Well, what's wrong? What's wrong? Go back and tell me. Logically, what are you looking at? Okay. I needs D to validate it. So if you say, hey, the theme of the Matrix is rebirth, well, there is a very literal scene where the hero is kind of looks like he's being born as an adult. You go back to the description of that scene, for instance. All right. I always needs a D. You can't say you don't respect me. Okay. This is how DINE can be used in interpersonal conversations, right? If you're having a misunderstanding, particularly with someone close to you, but with anyone, it is in business, in personal relationships, with children, you're probably missing D, I, or E, right? You say you don't respect me. Well, what is I don't respect you, right? It's, well, you don't reline the garbage cans. You don't, okay, that's descriptive. Okay, now, how does that in your experience mean I don't respect you? Right? It's, well, you say you're helping by taking out the trash, but then you're only doing half the job. Then you force me to do something else. And that makes me feel like you're being passive aggressive because my employees do that kind of stuff to me, or my parents did that kind of stuff to me. DIE, right? But I and D, you always have to pair. What are you interpreting? What piece of this thing are you looking at that you're coming up with that interpretation? Why do you think the theme of that film is rebirth? Why is the theme of the film abandonment? It's like, what plot characters are you looking at that makes that true? All right, and then what does that plot, do those characters remind you of? E, that creates that interpretation for you. All right, so the context is decisive, meaning that how you're looking, where you're looking from, even historically. None of the things that we're examining, okay, with the exception of the short film that I'm going to make you practice this on, is really all that recent. We're looking at a story from 1974, a film from 1982, a film from 1999, a film from 1995. But I'm asking you then to look at it from our 2019 perspective, right? You're not gonna, we're going to look at it from our own vantage point, okay? We just have to understand that we are looking at it from a different vantage point than the initial audiences. What you want to do is bring these elements into balance, which doesn't mean that I'm going to have one paragraph about D, one about I, one about E. But what that means is that you understand how your evaluative lens, your experience, is interacting with D, the thing that is there, to create an interpretation or meaning. Right? Simply that you articulate all of those elements. So the big idea is that while very personal and even emotional or visceral our interpretations, our meaning making can be, we use this method to speak about things academically, right? Because you can say, according to my morals, E, I'm looking at this thing, D, to mean it's right, it's wrong, it's good, it's bad. But at the moment that you diffuse and say, from my perspective, this is what creates that interpretation, you're no longer mistaking your interpretation, how it makes you feel, as the truth, as what is there. As soon as you understand that this is an interpretation, I will even give it a truth, just not the universal truth. You're opening a space where we can talk about things not from a strictly moral standpoint, but from an academic one, where we're actually investigating where our sense of morality might come from. Balancing descriptive, interpretive, and evaluative statements will enhance clarity. If I can tell you why I'm making the meaning that I'm making, like where it's coming from, what I'm looking at, how I'm looking at it, it's a lot easier for me to understand and go, yeah, you know what? I didn't see it that way, but you're right. Look at that. And all of a sudden you've got a really interesting piece of scholarship. Now understand it's not a linear process. The one thing I do definitely want to leave you with is the idea that we each have our own strengths. And we use DIE also as a sort of an academic, a scholarly checklist to say, am I covering all the bases? Am I being clear? Because it's for somebody who is very descriptive. Yes, you're going to walk through things. You're going to be very, very strong at looking, for instance, at the plot, at the design of a film, maybe even listening for the sound editing. You're going to be very good with looking at and really evaluating, like interpreting the worth of the technical elements. You're a D, right? You're good with space. You're good with placement. You're good with logical processes. You're good at mechanics. You're going to lead with D, and so you'll have to be aware. Okay, am I then articulating an awareness of what I make those elements mean? Right. I am highly interpretive. I'm an artist. I'm a musician in a band that probably 60% of our stuff is our covers reinterpreted. Listen, we mash up Johnny Cash's Folsom Prison Blues with Beyonce's Single Ladies. So there's definitely an interpretation that happens there, right? I'm a trained actor. So I am naturally seeing, I know immediately what something means. I come up with themes, allegories. I'm equating this film with that story that I heard, this real world incident with that story that I read. And I have to back up and say, okay, why? Both descriptively and what's in my experience, how am I seeing these things that I'm equating the two, that I'm drawing those parallels? Kim Jackson is very E. Remember the other professor that really started the whole DIE thing? I mean, really from investigating, she's a woman of color. And so those identifiers become very important. The perspective and how she's looking at things, right? And she's brought an awareness to me that so does my ethnic and gender and generational identity, Gen X. And so what you learn to do is look for your blind spots. If I know that I'm very much about what is my perspective and like my experience is forward, I'm an E, then I need to step back and go, okay, how much of that identity am I creating through interpretation? If I am I go straight to the meaning. I have to be very mindful to go back and remember to like there is no I without D, to tell you how I got there logically and stepping you through it. Okay, so this is also a way to be aware of where your blind spots are and how you can fill out that continuum. Right, a bit of a long explanation. I wanted to try and catch everything that we would catch in a live class in this. And I hope that makes it clear. There is, again, an exercise doing the DIE with a short film that is in this same unit. And again, I hope you find this helpful. This is the DIE method, and so when I say DIE, describe, interpret, this is what we're talking about. There will be certain films where I ask you, hey, I want you to try an interpretive question. Go back and revisit this. Look at those interpretive questions. Yeah? Okay. I'll see you in cyberspace.